Good morning, everyone. No, it's not. Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry, I've been here for like 5 hours and I forgot. So is this volume okay, or do I need to use the microphone in the room? That's okay? All right, if you really have trouble hearing me, then I'm happy to use the microphone, but if not, this is easier. So I'm glad to see you all. For those of you I've not met, my name is Chris. I'm the rector here, and we're going to go over a number of just technical things before we get into the lesson. First technical thing is that we are going to end at 1:30. I don't go over classes. I heard you had great extra fun last week, and I don't do that. So just prepare yourself. We will end on time, and so that is, I think, always a good thing. A few things about our paperwork. So there are two forms that I want to make sure you all do. First, just to sign in, there should be sign-in forms on your tables. Please just jot your name and stuff down so we can make sure that we know you were here. The other form is what says confirmation. Confirmation information form. I want to give a moment on that form first to say, I hope you will fill it out. I hope you will actually come and do our confirmation service with us. It's the second Sunday of November at 11 o'clock, and so I would love for you all to be there. I want to talk for a minute about the three checkboxes on that form. Confirmation, received, well, confirmed, received, reaffirmed. Confirmation, reception, reaffirmation. If you have never been confirmed, then you are going to seek confirmation. That's pretty easy. If you've only been and by the way, I assume this has been said to you all, but if you've not been baptized, then that's very exciting for me because I love baptizing adults. And so do not ever feel ashamed about it. You let us know. We would love to be baptized. Yes?
And you mean confirmed in any denomination, or is it?
Yes, good question. So question is whether you have been confirmed in any denomination. Technically speaking, not every denomination's confirmation counts canonically. Essentially, if you have been confirmed in a tradition where there is apostolic succession of priests, then that's super clear. And so that basically means Orthodox, Roman Catholic, Lutheran, Anglican, Episcopalian, all totally good. We also tend to just say you're fine if it were Methodist or Presbyterian. So if that is the case, you're really good. If you were confirmed in a tradition that is not common or where it has no real liturgical sensibility, then I would encourage you to just be reconfirmed. We don't rebaptize. If you've been baptized by anyone at any time, you are done. Check. Confirmation's a little different. So if you don't know, if you're unsure, if you don't remember, if you just want to be again, it is okay. Confirmation's a little different. And so I hope that's somewhat clear. Neil?
Does christening in the Anglican Church count?
No. No, christening depends on who's using the word. So christening could mean baptism. Christening could also mean promise to baptize later. So in the Anglican Church, my guess is that you were baptized. Check. If you were christened in, say, a Baptist church or even a Methodist church, that's almost certainly not baptism. That was a promise your parents made on your behalf that you would be baptized at some point, because those traditions intentionally do not baptize newborns or infants. Those traditions preference a person's actual choice to be baptized. It doesn't mean that they don't honor that parents will raise the child in the church, but that's typically what christening means. We have a lot of people who either come from Methodist or Baptist or other kinds of traditions in their family, or they were raised in one and became Episcopalian, and they still use the term christening. In the Episcopal Church, if someone ever says they were christened, 99% of the time, that means they were baptized. Christening is really just a promise for baptism, not baptism itself. So check it. There are some people who were baptized and said, I'd like to do it again. That is really nice. And unless you have some sort of like seriously compelling pastoral reason, We just on principle do not do that, because that baptism is not done by a person. Baptism is done by God. And so a person calls God's presence, but any person can do it. Every person's made in God's image. Every person can do it. And if that was done, it's done. Confirmation is a little different. Confirmation is a bit more of a sacramental ritual act. And so that it was done by a bishop does actually give it its gravitas, so to speak. And so in traditions that really don't have bishops, confirmation's sort of not exactly the same. So if you come from a liturgical tradition, Orthodox, Roman Catholic, Lutheran, Anglican, you have been confirmed, you're totally good. That would mean you would be received. So if you are coming from outside the Episcopal Church, but you've been confirmed, then we receive you as a confirmed member of the universal church. If you have been confirmed in the Episcopal Church or have already been received in the Episcopal Church, you can go through reaffirmation. And you're just reaffirming your commitment. We often recommend this for, say, a married couple where one is a confirmed Episcopalian and one is not. Well, the person who is already a confirmed Episcopalian, we'd love for them to go through this process with their spouse and just reaffirm the commitment, because now you're essentially doing it together. Reaffirmation can also be, say you just had a baby and you're starting a new chapter of your life. Say your kids just went off to college. That's a new chapter. Say you've just been widowed. Say you've been divorced. Any number of moments that are milestones of your life. Reaffirmation is actually really nice. You get a chance to think about who you are now, not who you were then, and actually reaffirm your commitment to following Christ in the Episcopal Church. Yes?
So that means, because earlier you said I would be received because I've been baptized and confirmed in the Catholic Church.
Yes.
Right? But I can still be reaffirmed.
So your reception is your reaffirmation. So her question was, sorry, there's a video of this, so I want to get it on video. The question was, if I have been baptized, confirmed in the Catholic Church, wouldn't I be reaffirmed here? And you will be in the future. But your very first time, we receive you. It is a reaffirmation. It's the same basic idea. They're all three the same basic idea. It's just whether or not there's a sacramental moment, and physically it's represented differently. So if you are confirmed, the bishop actually puts his hands on your head. If you are received or reaffirmed, the bishop holds your hands, because essentially the hands on the head moment has happened.
Right. Okay.
Then you can reaffirm anytime. So you technically, the truth here is really, it doesn't matter. We're being technical, and because the canons are technical, and I am happy to help you be technical. If there's one of these things that feels better to you, just do it, because I promise you Jesus doesn't care. So we're just simply doing the technically right thing, but don't let that get in the way. Other questions, just clarity about those three things?
Question about the form. We're already members here.
Yes.
It scares the hell out of me to ask me to fill out my name as would appear in the bulletin since I've already done that, so to speak.
You're not gonna get reaffirmed.
No, this says, you would like to appear in the bulletin.
Names as you'd like to appear in the bulletin is essentially because during the confirmation service, we put your names down in the bulletin so people know who you are. Because what we want is that the congregation really sees you. And so, when you come up and you do this, most of the people who are doing this are relatively new. That may not be every person in the room, but we like for the entire congregation to see you making this commitment, whichever form of the commitment it is. It's all a commitment. And so by seeing your name, they don't have to remember whatever the bishop just said. And they might find you afterwards and say, hey, great to see you, congratulations, whatever that is. And so that's just our awareness. If we were worshiping 40 people on a Sunday, this would not be a big deal, but we really like to publish names. The same way we publish the names of anyone who gets baptized. It's one of those just you know, you don't have to listen. You can really read the name that you're hearing said. And you might know the family, or someone might see you and think, I know her somewhere. And now they see your name, oh, I remember. And it's a nice way to make a connection. There's nothing more than that, really.
I was talking about confusion of church records.
Got it, yes. And if you are not a member yet, you can be a member anytime by just simply saying, I'd like to be a member. By being a baptized member or a confirmed member, your canonical status basically shifts. This is mostly official historic record. I was just explaining that these records that we keep are kept forever. And so I came from a church over 250 years old before I came here. People would come and do genealogical record keeping based on our church books. And so this is not just for today. This is for 100, 200 plus years from now. This is kept as a record. And they're old churches. I mean, we're only 76 years old, but churches hundreds of years old, these books are kept in vaults that are fireproofed and all that sort of stuff because they're irreplaceable. Yes?
This might sound a little off, but so is your confirmation essentially transferable to any other diocese?
Yes. So if you are confirmed in this church, you are confirmed in the Episcopal Church. And so if you ever moved and went to another Episcopal church, you simply let them know you're there. They let us know that you have moved. So say you go to Denver or something like that. Then you just find a church there. You let them know you'd like to become a member there. They contact us because you told them I used to go to St. Michael in Dallas. And we actually send a letter with your official records that then transfers to that particular church. Remember, this is all, we're going to talk a little bit about this. This is all based on models where in England, a parish, I mean, you're familiar with that word. We call ourselves a parish. That is an English word we have adopted, but we don't use it the same way. Here in America, a parish is just the members of the church. In England, every person was a member of a parish. A parish was essentially like a county. And so there was a church for every parish, every county, and every person in that county was a member of that parish. It was almost like a census-style management of people. We've kept a lot of those words, we just don't keep their meaning. And so by transferring you from one Episcopal church to the next, that was actually like legal stuff in England. Here, it's just nice. So there you go. Other questions just about membership before we get into the good history stuff? All right, so we are going to talk about the history of the Anglican Church and the Episcopal Church, which is essentially about, 15 to 1600 years of history. Here we go. Everything started when the Roman Church decided that they needed to go and convert the pagans of the British Isles. And so if you can go back in time to the Roman Empire, you know that the Roman Empire straddled the shift from what we would consider before the Common Era to the Common Era, or Jesus's moment. And so then you've got 470 years of Rome until it kind of starts to fall apart, then it sort of reforms. And in that reforming of the Roman Empire, Gregory the Great decides that he's going to go off and save the British Isles. And so this was essentially a chance for Rome to increase its influence. As Rome fell, so did their authority. And so this is a redevelopment of Roman authority. And so Pope Gregory I, who is Gregory the Great, sends off Augustine to go to the British Isles and save them. So if you think geographically, Augustine goes up from Rome through France, hits sort of that Calais area, goes to sort of Dover, like you would take a boat today, and ends up planting his flag in a southeastern area of the UK called Canterbury. And so Canterbury is essentially where St. Augustine at the time, set up shop to save all of the pagans. And so that is why today the titular head of the Anglican Church worldwide is the Archbishop of Canterbury. It's sort of odd because the Archbishop of Canterbury lives in London. and is part of the House of Lords. And so you're sort of like, I mean, why Canterbury? This is why Canterbury. Because the first founder of Christianity in the British Isles was Augustine, and he lived in Canterbury. Sound good? Essentially, Britain takes on Christianity for many different reasons. One is principally because they were really good at adopting Christianity to the culture that was already there. So I say pagans because that's what the Roman Church says, but not really. There are people living in the British Isles who are highly religious in their identity, but that kind of spirituality that predates Christianity is not the same as Christianity. And so what those early Christians did is they adopted many of the interesting things that the people in Britain were already doing and then put Christianity on top. Right? So it's things like, why do we have Christmas trees at Christmas? Because the Germans used pines during their winter festivals, which was kind of like Christmas. And so Christians were like, hey, let's use those trees at our Christian holiday, and then you're off to the races and the Germans become Christian. So similarly, you go to Britain, and there are many different small ways in which those people in Britain were already religious. And so Christianity just kind of picked and chose some interesting things, and it said, actually, you know why you do that? That's because Jesus did this. And so the people of Britain were kind of like, oh, well, that sounds nice. And so the conversion happened relatively quickly. When we get the Norman conquest, about 500 years later, that's when Christianity really takes off as the official legal state religion. And so most of us probably, well, no, sorry, I won't say it that way. When the Norman, William the Conqueror gets over to Britain, Britain becomes essentially now European in a sense, and begins to develop in a formal way that then relates to the other kingdoms on the European continent. Fast forward a few hundred years, and England is still sort of the low country on the totem pole of Europe. Your older European nations, especially nations like France and Spain and Germany and the others, see England as kind of like the stepchild over here. And they're not quite as strong, they're not as organized, they're not as powerful, but they're getting there. One of the ways that they get there is through education. There is a professor of sorts, John Wycliffe, who begins to teach in the 14th century a new way to be Christian. These new ideas of how to be Christian begin to filter down in very meaningful ways. John Wycliffe had lots of important students. There's one student I want you to know about in particular, Jan Hus. Jan Hus was a Czech theologian. He went to England to study with John Wycliffe. John Wycliffe is having all of these interesting new ideas about Christianity. He's identifying some problems with the Roman Church, some ways they could do better. As he's studying scripture, he's seeing some inconsistencies with the way that Rome operates. And so he's beginning to play with these ideas with his students. Well, Jan Hus, who's the next generation under, takes a lot of these ideas back to the continent. So it's important for us to remember that we may think of Britain as just Europe, well, until Brexit, but Britain is somewhat different specifically because of the English Channel. It was not easy to go back and forth from Britain to the continent. And so you had to have money in order to sail back and forth. And Jan Hus came and went, but ideas were more difficult to share. When you're in France, you can get to Switzerland pretty easily. Or if you're in Italy, you can go over to Spain. It's land. And so just the travel is just a bit easier than it is to sail. So what happens is Wycliffe's ideas go back to continental Europe with Hus. Hus begins to teach his own students. Wycliffe continues to teach his own students. And you have to fast forward about 200 years before we get to the Reformation. Now, before we get to the Reformation, questions about Rome, going and sending Augustine to the UK, Norman conquest, because we've sort of jumped now about 1,000 years. So any clarity about how we got from about 500 to about 1500? Good, you'll do well in the quiz. It's just a few minutes. So now we get to the Reformation. Big idea for you all as Episcopalians. There were two Reformations. We, as Episcopalians, we are Anglican Christians. We are not Protestant. If your friends tell you that we are Protestant, then you can politely tell them they're wrong. Because there are two Reformations that happened at about the same time. A Reformation on the continent and a Reformation in Britain. So let's talk about the Reformation on the continent. This is the one we know most about. This is Martin Luther walking up his theses and tacking them on the door of the cathedral, and then spark that set off a flame that broke away from Rome. It is important to know, all Martin Luther did, he's just the one that put it on paper. There were a bunch of people talking about this for a very long time. Martin Luther just happened to get the attention. And so in Germany, Luther begins to challenge what Rome has been doing. In France, Calvin begins to challenge what Rome is doing. In Switzerland, Ulrich Zwingli begins to challenge what Rome has been doing. And so what you get are all of these like sort of north of Rome European countries that begin to gather some steam around Rome is not really doing this Christian thing right. Now I'm going to pause because that sounds extremely holy and virtuous. What is happening in these countries is not quite as virtuous as it might be. It's always about power. And so if the church is somehow beholden to Rome, if the French church is beholden to Rome, then France is always beholden in some way to Italy. If the German church is beholden to Rome, then Germany is always beholden somehow to Italy, and on and on and on. So it is politically savvy for the people in these countries to actually support a break from Rome religiously, because then the political independence follows. Make sense? That idea you can put right on top of Britain. It is common that people say, oh, the Anglican Church started because Henry VIII got mad. The Anglican Church started because Henry VIII finally put the political will behind the theological changes they had been seeking to make. So I'll say that differently. For 200 years, these ideas of reforming what the Roman Church had been were percolating. But you can't really get anything done unless the politicians want it done, especially if you're a monarchy. And it wasn't until Henry VIII got sideways with the Pope, because he sought an annulment in order to get remarried, that the theologians saw their opportunity. And so they seized on the opportunity that Henry didn't like the Pope to essentially start something new. It just so happened that was happening in Britain while this other stuff was happening on the continent. What else do I want to say to you?
What year was that? 1533?
Yeah, it was middle 1500s. And so even though it happened at the same time, their reformations were a little different. Let me see if I've got, nah, not that yet. So, slide. There we go. Let's talk about what the reformations were. The Reformation on the European continent had different forms. So, from Martin Luther, you get the Lutheran Church. From John Calvin, you get the Presbyterian Church. So they didn't all stay totally linked. But there is a similar ground of spiritual being with the Reformers. It was really a reformation from the outside in. And so what I mean by that is they didn't want to do or look like the Roman Church anymore. And so most of those traditions began to worship differently. They stopped wearing all the stuff. They simplified their spaces. Have you ever been to churches in, if you were to go to post-Reformation churches in Germany, for example, they are super simple churches. They're not Gothic with all the stuff that you would see, especially in Italy, but even in pre-Reformation churches in places like France or Germany, they're far more elaborate in their architecture and their design than post-Reformation churches. So they stripped a lot of that stuff away. They acted differently. Sermons became more important, not communion and things like that. But there is a fundamental starting place that remained the same. So to back up, did you all do like Christian history with the Great Schism? Have you done this yet? Okay, sorry, back up. There are 4 major branches of Christianity. For 1,000 years, until 1054, there was only just Christian. But in 1054, the east and western parts of the former Roman Empire broke. And that's when you get the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox churches. With that break in 1054, it's called the Great Schism. You get 2 major branches of Christianity for the first time. So for the first 1,000 years, there's just Christian. In 1054, you get 2 major branches, East and West, Roman and Orthodox. At this point, with the Reformation, you get 2 more, Protestant and Anglican. Although there are plenty of divisions, I mean, by some estimates, there are 40,000 different denominations of Christianity around the world. They all basically are anchored in these 4 ideas, these 4 ways of being. For the first 3, Roman, Orthodox, Protestant, the starting place is we can fully know what God is and wants us to do. And so if you've ever looked at a Roman Catholic catechism, it is gigantic. Because the starting place is, if you've got a question, we can answer your question. And so you have people over time, like Thomas Aquinas, for example, who was a masterful, genius lawyer. And like the Jewish people before, there was this massive legal system that was put in place in order to make sure that everything we do is consistent, because we can fully know God. Anglicans are a little different. Our Reformation was really a Reformation from inside the church, because our starting place shifted. Rather than starting from a place of we can fully know God and we can know exactly what God wants us to do all the time, we shifted to say we will never fully know God, and we can do our best right now, but we will constantly continue to learn how to do better. That's a really radical different place. Now, because it was a Reformation from inside the church, we still look super Catholic. And so we wear the collars and we put on the big shiny dresses and we swing incense and the bells and the organ and all the other stuff. So we still look very much like the church that we broke from. But the core identity is a complete shift, which is why as Episcopalians, we don't have really a catechism. If you look in the Book of Common Prayer and you go to the catechism, it's like 20 pages. And it basically says, who's God? God is triune, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. The end. And who's Jesus? Jesus is the Son of God and came to earth. The end. So for most other Christians, you would say that's the first sentence of a whole long list of stuff. Lots of boxes to check. Lots of things to agree to. Lots of rules that you should not break. Episcopalians tend not to be terribly rule-driven. I mean, we kind of have some fundamentals like God is real. Okay, good. I mean, I hope we're all good for that. But other than that, we kind of open up to God's still doing stuff. God's not locked in the pages of the Bible. God's still revealing truth right now, which means we can learn to do this better. The classic example would be, can women be priests? It took too long, but our system and our theology allows us to say yes. Even though others, we may not have done it in the past, we can still very thoughtfully and prayerfully, and sometimes too slowly, we can allow changes to happen that completely redo the way that we function together. And that's okay, because that's baked in our DNA. From the very beginning, we said, we can do better. And so it's one of those classic examples. One of my favorite quotes is Maya Angelou: do the best you can until you know better, then do better. And I kind of feel like she was an Anglican at heart, because that's kind of it. Like, we have to do something, so we're doing the best we can. When we learn how to do it better, let's do it better. And we don't have to like flog ourselves for having made the mistake in the past, but we better do it right in the future. So that's the kind of way that we are different, so to speak, than the other three branches of Christianity. All right, questions or clarity about that?
Yeah, that's true.
And so
I
what,
wasn't a Roman Catholic background, but I think if we had a good Jesuit in the room, he would say, you're just not accurately describing the Roman Church today.
Do you have a question?
No. no matter
Well,
what.
then thank you for your... Well, that's not really a quarrel. Can you be more articulate?
And not to take your point away, because I think that one of the reasons that my wife and I chose to be Anglicans is exactly what you are teaching.
Uh-huh.
I'm not a Catholic, but I think that, I think it's prejudiced to suggest that there are reform movements, if you would.
So what I'd love to say is every summary of any complex system is not going to identify every detail about that system. It does not make the summary inaccurate. It just means that there is more to it than what a 90-second summary can offer. And it's less important that we are clear about what the Roman Church does or does not do, and more important that we are clear about what the Anglican Church is or is not. So I appreciate that. Any other questions or clarity? Because it's really important for you all to kind of vet a little of this. We don't do this class very long. And it's not always easy to wonder aloud about the tradition. And so this is kind of an opportunity to just, in a sense, ask a dumb, basic question. Like if you had a 9-year-old in this room, what question would they ask? Because it's very obvious that they don't know.
Neil has a dumb question.
Thank you, Neil.
Always.
In broad strokes, what do Protestants do differently than the Reformers, or how is the Protestant Church shaped differently than the Anglican?
That's a good segue to the next thing. Here's just a fun little chart that I understand is not easily readable from where you are in the room. And so instead, let me just explain it. So you've got kind of the Catholic Church, or the one universal Christian church, for a while. Then it splits. And you've got, from that Catholic Church, you've got a few major splits. You've got the English, and this says German. I did not make this chart. But essentially what you've got here are English groups and German or Protestant groups down here. And so what's very interesting to note is that from the English split, you get Anglicans and Episcopalians. That makes sense. You also get Methodists. And you may have heard me say this in Bible study or something like that, but the Wesley brothers were Anglican priests. They were students at Oxford preparing to be priests, and they were not satisfied with the way in which Anglicans went about expressing their faith. And so essentially they created a method that would help them be consistent in their faith formation. Well, their colleagues and seminary buddies made fun of them, and they called them Methodists because of their method to working toward perfection. If you've ever know anything about the Methodist Church, you know that Methodism has this idea that you can work really hard toward perfection. And that comes directly from the Wesleys, but the Wesleys were Anglican priests. And so there's a lot about Methodism and Wesleyanism that is fundamentally Anglican, but with this appreciation for a methodology that keeps our humanity in check. So that's where you get Methodists. When Anglicans and then Methodists and Puritans and all the others come to America, they begin to mix in very creative ways. So it is a non-European expression of Christianity forms what we would then call Baptists or Congregationalists. Baptists are an American tradition, and it comes by mixing up Anglicans, Methodists, really Lutherans, Presbyterians, all of them get all mixed up and start to revive their faith regularly. That's where you get the idea of revivals. And an entirely new branch that is congregational is formed. And the difference between what would be a hierarchical structure, think Roman Orthodox, Anglican, Methodist, Presbyterian, Lutheran, they all have ordained people, and they have some kind of structure, whether it's a diocese or a synod or a presbytery or whatever, that has somebody, kind of a bishop or bishop-like people, that kind of keep things organized. That all goes away. And you get a group of people who elect their own pastor to do their own formation and preaching and teaching in their own way. That's a Congregationalist. Baptists are essentially the most organized Congregationalists in the country. But as you likely know, and why it's dangerous is, you don't have to have any formal education or training of any kind to be a Baptist preacher. You just have to convince people that you, I don't know, love Jesus enough or something. And so that then puts people up in front of other people, teaching in a way that is kind of disconnected from both tradition or strategy or complexity or you name it. And so I don't know how many times I have wonderful former Baptists who will come to my Bible study and they will say, I've never heard anything like this. Duh. I mean, your preacher probably didn't know this stuff. I mean, that's really just that simple. And so I know. It's so snobby, isn't it? So back to your question. Thanks. Neil, will it's so general. Do you have a sharper point on that question?
I just, if you had to give someone the elevator pitch of the difference between Protestants and Anglicans, what would that be?
It would be what I just said, which is we don't presume to know that we know everything about God or what we're supposed to do. And instead, we know God's real, and we know we are loved, and we know that we're called to love others, and we're going to do the best we can until we learn better, and then we're going to do better. And I think that that's one of the reasons why Episcopalians tend to find themselves in this gray area. I mean, if you look at America right now, we are extremely divided and partisan, and you can't really put Episcopalians in one box or the other, although people try really hard. St. Michael's a great example of we do not do partisan stuff. We are equal opportunity offenders. You give me some policy in some political group, and I'm going to tell you why that is also imperfect, and we can do better. And that's difficult to maintain right now because the world is telling us to criticize and or fear whoever disagrees with us. And we are essentially allowing ourselves to live into the assumption that we can't disagree and be together. And that was always the case. Why can't we? Any Sunday here, there are people in our pews that run the entire gamut of the partisan spectrum. From right to left and everywhere in between, everyone is there. And there is this sense that regardless of what we think we know, as good Anglicans, we know we don't know everything. Doesn't mean you can't have an opinion. It doesn't mean you can't work toward that opinion. But to presume that you know everything starts you in the wrong place. And so our faith actually calls us to the humility that we don't know everything. And so have an opinion, sure. But always, always be open to your opinion improving and becoming more complex and more impactful as you go. That's baked into our faith in a way that I love. Other than if it were not that way, I could not do this because otherwise it's just ignorant.
Question. So can you tell me, like, what is the basis for
I'm wondering if I get to much of, not really. I would like the real answer, as quick as I can make it, is that it did not necessarily start out that way. I do think that the Anglican Reformation did not intend to create what we might today call like a big tent. But it was in the way in which they balanced two principal ideas. One, they held on to the sacramentalism of the Roman Church. So we still do hold on to the apostolic succession, which means that every ordained person was ordained by a person who was ordained by a person, and we can actually trace it all the way back to Jesus touching Peter. So there is this is what I've been told. If you look at the bishop who ordained me, and the bishop who ordained him, and the bishop who ordained him, we can trace that all the way back. So we keep that kind of idea of sacramentalism and mystery, but we pair it with the desire to raise up the people who are experiencing those sacraments. And so from the very beginning, Thomas Cranmer, who was the archbishop at the time when Henry VIII split, wrote a book of common prayer. Now, we might think that is sort of normal, why not? But at the time, completely revolutionary. Never had prayers been in the language spoken by the people. It had always been in Latin. And part of maintaining the Latin was maintaining the authority, because the average person wasn't even literate, let alone could speak or understand Latin. So the educated people, the priests, had a one-up on all the people. They couldn't read the Bible, they couldn't say the prayers, they couldn't do all these things. They could only do what the priest told them. So the priest was able to say, the Bible says X, and everyone said, okay. They can't read it on their own, they can't think about it on their own. There was no Bible study, nothing like that. And so baked right into the very beginning of Anglicanism was this sense of empowering the lay people. Well, over time, that tension of sacramentalism and the empowerment, the priesthood of all believers is the way that we express that, necessarily developed into a theological idea that God's revealing truth all the time through everyone. So that didn't really, they weren't super clear at the very beginning, but the components, the ingredients in a sense, were there at the beginning that allowed that idea to grow. That idea has been challenged many times throughout history. Right now, I can say things like, women's ordination. I can say things like integrated, non-racially differentiated worship. I can say things like same-sex marriages, and you name whatever you want. And there are all these different progressive issues that have come up where essentially the Episcopal Church, as Anglican Christians, have wrestled and said, these people are doing the best that they can and being faithful people. Why would God not accept that? And then you ask that question, there's no better answer than God would totally accept that. So then how do we have to change what we do in our structures in order to better understand the huge, what really is grace? That is grace. If grace is true, then God's love has no limits. We certainly can't put a limit on it. And so that has taken a long time to become a regular habit. Anglican Church around the world does not necessarily all agree that that is the right way to exercise their theology. And so there are Anglicans around the world who essentially function more like Presbyterians with tight legal structures around what is and is not okay, who is in and who is out. It's that kind of stuff. It's a bit more litmus test of right theology than what has happened over here. And you can there is no way to uncouple the culture from the religion, because the people who make up the religious body are also people who live in the culture. And so it's complicated. But at the very beginning, there was this sense of people matter as individuals. So we want them to pray in the language they understand. We want them to be able to read the Bible in the language they understand. And if that means they begin to have a different experience of God in their own life, then that's the messiness that we invite when we empower everyone to believe that they get to experience God their own way. But the tension with Episcopalians or Anglicans is it's always communal. It is never individual. So what you do not hear people like me say is, are you saved? I don't disagree with the concept, but fundamentally, we don't preference the individual expression of faith. We preference the corporate expression of faith. So we really do land with when 2 or 3 are gathered, not one. So can you go off be Christian by yourself? It's not a good idea, because any one of us will go way off the rails. And so we need each other to look at, what's a holy friend to me is the person who can look at me and say, what are you doing? That is not good for you, or why are you such a jerk? Stop. It's that kind of stuff. That's what we're here for. That's what we do for each other with that kind of love, that we don't let one another get too far off track. That's why community matters, which is one of the reasons why you don't hear a lot of preference of individual faith here. It's much more corporate faith. Doesn't mean the individual doesn't matter. We are still individuals, but it's only insofar as we relate to one another. Other questions or comments? All right, let's just hit a little more history because it's helpful. Okay, so I kind of touched on this. Henry VIII wanted to have an annulment. He got mad, and so Pope Clement kicked him out, and then interestingly, Henry VIII was a very faithful Catholic. He ultimately didn't really like not being Catholic, and he was very conflicted. He wanted to get remarried again and again and again, but he really wanted to be Catholic, and he just wanted the Pope to let him do both. And that was the frustration. And so fast forward, we do have this weird period of time in the Anglican Church where it kind of swings back and forth and back and forth, because you get essentially, you've got Henry's 3 kids who each are monarchs with different intention, starting with Edward, who wanted to be Protestant or wanted to be Anglican, not Catholic, but kinda, and he didn't really understand and whatever. So then he wasn't around for very long. And then you get Mary, and Mary was super Catholic because her mother was Spanish, and so you had like real Catholic there. And so she swung back and she got mad, and then people got mad at her and gave her the nickname Bloody Mary, and because she killed people who were Anglican and whatever. So fast forward all of that, then you get Elizabeth. Elizabeth I comes onto the throne. Elizabeth I is super Anglican, does not want to be Catholic, and her monarchy is long enough to essentially put all the stuff behind them. And from Elizabeth on, you really do get the clarity of people in England are different kinds of Christians. That Anglicanism really takes root under Elizabeth, and then we're off to the races. What is important about the Anglican Church is to understand it was spread by colonialism. So about this time, England's becoming a real colonial power. And so where England plants a colony, they also take their church. So the English church, the Anglican, we use Anglican, that word in like 5 different ways. So if it's confusing, sorry. The Anglican church are all the churches around the world that root themselves back to the Church of England under the Archbishop of Canterbury. That's really the only definition. But because England was a colonial power, they founded Anglican churches within the country borders. And so there is only one Anglican church in any given country in the world. That's just the way they're structured. So you may know a person here in Dallas who says they're not Episcopalian, they're Anglican. That essentially means they don't care for women or same-sex marriage or all the other stuff. And so Anglicans here in the US wish to be recognized by the Archbishop of Canterbury. They are not, nor are they going to be, because
Recognized by an archbishop in Nigeria, for example.
yes, which essentially doesn't count. So what happened in America when we began to branch and split, there were little groups of Anglicans that decided things like, when the new prayer book came out in 1979, which is before I was born, which I think is really funny, when that new prayer book came out, people said, "Wah, we like the old prayer book." And so they went over here. When they decided to start ordaining women, they went, "Oh my God, no women." And so every group kind of said, "We don't like that one thing," and then branched off and did some stuff. Because they could not get the Archbishop of Canterbury to recognize them, there were wonderfully opportunistic bishops in Africa who decided, ooh, money. And so, theology. No. So they saw money in America and decided to bring these American Anglican churches under their umbrella. What is interesting is that that's a no-no. The Church of England says that does not work because the church is within national boundaries. It doesn't mean they're not trying. And they will tell a different story, but the Archbishop of Canterbury has not recognized any of these reorganizations and will not, because when they do, then the Episcopal Church is going to freak. And so they're just simply making a political decision not to recognize them. That's a very quick oversimplification, but it still works. So come to America, the colonies here brought the Anglican Church with them, and as America established itself separate from England, am I there? Yes. So the American Revolution was a challenge to the good Anglicans in the colonies because they're members of the Church of England, but it wasn't very attractive to relate to England at the time of the American Revolution. And so the Anglicans in America decided that they needed to do something that didn't make them sound so English. And so they created the Episcopal Church. So if you ever wondered why we're not the Anglican Church in America, which is almost every other Anglican church around the world, is the Anglican Church of Canada, the Anglican Church of South Africa, the Anglican Church of Korea, whatever that is. We are the Episcopal Church in the United States of America because it was far better for us politically to not yoke ourselves to England once we won the revolution, or once England lost, it might be the better way. So any questions about that before we talk about the way the Episcopal Church was ultimately established? Because it's a great story.
So there's no other Episcopalians except in America?
There's one other Episcopal church. I jumped ahead. So thank you. Great question. Episcopal means church of bishops. So if you hear the word episcopate, that means a bishop's seat. And so we used the word episcopal to essentially say we are a church that has bishops. And so it's not inaccurate, but we wanted to not use the word Anglican. It is not only because it was nice to not be related to England, but when we started in America, so America has won the revolution, and now we have to actually do something new here. We can't just be the Church of England in the colonies, we have to actually be our own church. So the people here, many of the founders were Anglicans of America, and so they elected a priest who would be the first bishop of the new American church. And that bishop, Samuel Seabury, was sent back to England to be made a bishop. Now here's an interesting detail. One bishop can make a priest. It takes 3 bishops to make a bishop. And that's mostly because of apostolic succession. Just in case one bishop wasn't quite in the line of succession, you got 2 more that were, so you're safe. So it takes 3 bishops to make a new bishop. So Samuel Seabury was sent back to England in order to be made a bishop, because there were no bishops in America, because the bishops had fled. They were like, see ya. So Samuel Seabury shows up in England and says, hey, everybody, remember us? We just beat you in the war. And would you please ordain me to be a bishop in America? How'd you think that went over? England was like, you know, they were licking their wounds having lost to these upstarts in this country, and they're not going to give us anything. So England refuses and refuses and refuses to make Samuel Seabury a bishop. There is a group of people near England who really hates English people. Can you think of them? Scotland, yes. The Scottish Church is the other church that is the Episcopal Church of Scotland. And so the Scots were happy to do anything to make the English mad. And so they invited William Seabury to come right on up. And 3 Scottish bishops consecrated and made Seabury a bishop. And so at that point, England kind of knew they could either be really pig-headed, or they could understand that they would like to have a good relationship with America at some point, even if they're kind of feeling the sting right now. And so Seabury becomes the first bishop. A couple more people were made bishops in the American church, and then we're off to the races. Now you've got 3 bishops in America. They can make more bishops. All those bishops can make priests. And now you've got the Episcopal Church in the United States in honor of the Episcopal Church of Scotland, who ordained, consecrated the very first bishop. I really like that story. Okay. Very quickly, just because it's helpful to know, as with any organized religion, how do you organize yourself? Well, the founders of America were almost 100% Anglicans, so became Episcopalians. So when the Episcopal Church, the new church in America, began to create its structure, they naturally looked to the same organizational structure they liked that they had just done for the country. So you've got our founders create a system of checks and balances between the executive branch and the legislative branch and the judicial branch. And then you've got the legislative branch that essentially has 2 houses in it. Well, if you take that model and kind of put it right on top of the Episcopal Church, it's pretty close. And so the Episcopal Church is structured in a very specific way. You have a legislative body that is made up of 2 houses, one house of bishops and one house of deputies. The deputies are priests, deacons, and lay people. The house of bishops you can think of as the Senate. Every diocese has a bishop in that house, regardless of size. The house of deputies you can think of as the House of Representatives. Based on a diocese size, they get a certain number of representatives. So you might have a place like Texas that has a huge number of representatives in the House of Deputies, but they have the same one bishop in the House of Bishops as Fond du Lac up in Michigan, who has like 10 people in it. And so they have equal representation in the House of Bishops and percentage representation based on population in the House of Deputies. Very similar. And that's how we make decisions. Every 3 years, those 2 bodies gather at what we call a general convention, and they kind of, well, nowadays they don't really do anything, but it was important for a long time that they tried to pass, it's hard to even say they're rules. We're Anglicans, which means they're sort of never really rules, but there are like really strong suggestions where they say we really should be like this moving forward. And so you had a number of, I'll go back to female ordination. We had a number of dioceses that were figuring out that women were called to be priests. And so at some point it was taken to General Convention where these houses considered whether women should be ordained or not, and ultimately agreed upon that in the entire church, women could be ordained. Now, interestingly, that doesn't mean that every single bishop everywhere was excited about that and wanted to do it. But it does mean that they should. And that's about as firm as we get in the Episcopal Church, which is really annoying. I was also raised in the Catholic Church, and there are moments where I wish we could just say, it's gonna be that way, shut up. And that just doesn't really work in the Episcopal Church because we are so very honorable to one another, and we don't want to leave anyone out, which is that's how Jesus would wanted. So, hold on, I see a question here. Yeah.
Chris, does that mean the bishop makes that decision?
About ordination? Yes. So in our structure, I think I have a picture. Hold on.
Follow-up, and then is a bishop elected or replaced, or what's the tenure?
I like both of those questions. So I've talked through all these slides, which is not helpful to you because I didn't switch them. Okay. So here's a picture of the US. Every boundary is a different diocese. So a diocese is a collection of parishes and other ministries under a single bishop. In every diocese, there are over 100 in the Episcopal Church. In every diocese, a bishop is elected. That bishop might have been a bishop before. That happens occasionally. Most of the time, that bishop has been a priest somewhere, is elected through a search process kind of thing, and then made diocesan bishop. That diocesan bishop can stay in their seat until they're 72. We have mandatory retirement at age 72, which is a wonderful blessing. And so then they have to retire. Every diocese replaces their bishop on their own. It is kind of like states' rights. So remember, same founders of the United States created the Episcopal Church. And so when they did the whole states' right business, they did the same thing with diocesan rights. So here's the interesting thing. If you know much about our history, you remember that 20 years ago, New Hampshire elected an openly gay man to be bishop. At the time, most people perceived that election as problematic for the entire Episcopal Church. Except that if you were really looking at our documents, what you would know is that every diocese gets to elect their own person as bishop. It doesn't mean that the other dioceses have to agree that that's a good person to be bishop. It simply means that the other dioceses have to agree that the process to elect that person was done well. And so we had a number of people, St. Michael's rector at the time is a good example, who went to the General Convention as a deputy, voted, yes, New Hampshire can elect this person as bishop because he qualified in all of these ways, and then got skewered here for having said yes because people misperceived that he thought that man should be bishop. When really what he said is the election was fair and done with the right rules. And so if you think states' rights, that's kind of, so all of that is to say, because of states' rights, diocesan rights, when there are decisions made like women can be ordained priests, the people who ordain priests are still diocesan bishops. They do not have to do anything. They basically have the right not to do anything they don't want to do. And there is a collegiality among all of the bishops where pretty much they hold each other accountable to not go off the rails in some way. But it's all collegial. It's all community driven. There is no legal authority. So in the Catholic Church where you have legal authority in a hierarchical structure, we don't have that. Every diocesan bishop is the ultimate legal authority in their diocese. Now, it doesn't mean they can't be sued, in a sense, to kind of like do the right thing, which has happened in many very unfortunate ways. But in the end, they really don't have to. They have to answer for it. They make a decision people don't like. They still have to answer to the people. But it puts the onus on the people rather than on other bishops to hold them accountable.
So how come they're elected, like, and do they have to be re-elected? Because maybe they make a
No.
decision that they don't like, and now you're stuck with this.
Once you have a diocesan bishop, yes.
Yeah, okay.
Once you have a diocesan bishop, they're elected for life or until mandatory retirement, so essentially age 72. Which is one of the reasons why you don't often see young people elected bishops. There are plenty of young people who would make way better bishops than a lot of the older people who are elected, But when a diocese is looking at a 37-year-old who's fantastic, what they really see is, if we don't like them, we're stuck. And so that's why you typically don't see people elected before they're kind of mid to late 50s, because then at least it's not for too long. So I saw one last, and then...
So can you hear analogy? There's no like full faith or credit between dioceses. Like, so can one bishop be prevented from, performing service in another diocese?
That's a very good question. Okay, so the question is there full communion and leadership opportunities from diocese to diocese? So I'm going to answer that in a couple parts. There are 3 orders of ordination. I see the time. We got 90 seconds. I'll be done. There are 3 orders of ordination: deacon, priest, bishop. Bishops can only function. Bishops have authority in their diocese. A bishop can function as a bishop in any other diocese at the permission of that diocese bishop. And so the collegiality is extremely high. It's very rare to ever hear of one bishop saying no to another bishop. In fact, I can't even think of one moment like that. But there is the collegiality of if I want to go and, I don't know, marry my grandchild in some other diocese, I would write to the bishop of that diocese as the bishop of this diocese to just get their permission. And of course they would grant it, because that's just, they would want you to do the same. They would want the reciprocal kind of authority. Where that happens for us is that occasionally I have invited bishops I know to come and do confirmation services. I have to write to our bishop to get the permission to bring that bishop here to do that confirmation service, because our diocesan bishop has the authority in this diocese. And like I said, it's never really a problem. Now, deacons. Deacons are not priests, and they work only at the pleasure of their bishop. So a deacon can only function as a deacon within the diocese where they are ordained or where they are resident. Priests are different. Priests are essentially free agents. And so once you're a priest, you can function as a priest in any diocese in any capacity. There are some people who think you're supposed to get permission from bishops. You don't actually have to. Again, it's polite. But I can go to a wedding in any state I want, and I don't have to ask, technically. It's nice, and I do, because why not? I'm not going to be told no, so it's just collegial again. But I don't have to, it is not illegal for me to go somewhere and do like a wedding or a funeral or something like that somewhere else. So priests often move from one church to another, and when that happens, you have to get the thumbs up from the bishop to move your residency. We are resident in a particular diocese, but that's just kind of the same way you are members of one particular church. It doesn't mean you can't then go to a different church. It just simply means, officially speaking, we have to transfer. It just keeps everything in order. And if, Anglicans like anything, it's order. All right. Thank you all. I know it's a time. I appreciate being with you. I'm going to see you again in 2 weeks. Mary Lesson's going to be with you next week. Thanks for doing this. And if you have questions, find me. Bye.